wind didn't howl. It screamed. It was a solid thing. A wall of white malice that tore at Clara Wynn's face and stole the breath from her lungs before she could rightly draw it. Each crystal of snow was a needle, driven horizontal by a gale that had been born somewhere in the frozen north and had found its sole purpose in trying to kill her. Her shawl, a thin thing of worn wool, was useless. She had pulled it over her head, but the wind ripped it back, plastering her dark hair to her skull with ice. Her coat, the only one she owned, was threadbare at the elbows and offered no more warmth than wet paper. Beneath her dress, her legs were numb, strange stilts that she commanded to move but barely felt. She had stopped feeling her feet miles ago. It might have been hours. It might have been a day. Time had frozen, shattered, and blown away with the snow. She was fleeing. The thought was the only ember left in her mind. Silas, her husband's brother. A hard man with a hard mouth and eyes as cold as the landscape. After the mine collapse had taken her husband. Silas had waited barely a week. The traditional mourning period a mockery in his clipped, impatient words. Cyrus had been no prize. His hands quick to anger and his heart small. But he had been a buffer. Now the buffer was gone. The ranch is in debt. Clara, Silas had said, standing too close to her in the cold parlor, the smell of cheap whiskey and onions on his breath. Cyrus left you with nothing, less than nothing. You'll work off his share, the house, the laundry. You're lucky I don't turn you out. She had seen the look in his eyes. It was not about laundry. It was about possession. She was just another piece of property, like the barren fields and the bony cattle. When he had grabbed her arm 2 nights ago, his thumb digging into her flesh, his meaning had become plain. A widow needs comfort, he'd slurred, and I need an heir. Clara had wrenched free, her revulsion giving her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She had hit him with the iron skillet, a glancing blow to the temple that had surprised him more than hurt him. But it was enough. While he lay stunned and cursing on the kitchen floor, she had grabbed her coat and the shawl and run. She took no food, no money. There was none to take. She just ran, out of the dark ranch house and into the teeth of the budding storm. Now, she regretted not hitting him harder. She regretted not aiming for his throat. She stumbled, her numb leg catching on a buried root or a rock. She fell hard, pitching forward into a drift. The snow packed into her mouth and nose, a suffocating, icy pillow. For a long moment, she just lay there. It was so easy. The screaming of the wind faded, becoming almost a lullaby. The cold was no longer painful. It was just a deep, heavy quiet. She could sleep. Cyrus was gone. Silas was behind her. She could just stop. One of her gloves, the one with the hole in the thumb, had been torn off in the fall. She lay looking at her bare hand, the skin already blue-white, the snow melting on it from the last of her body's heat. She thought of her mother, dead 10 years, her face a dim watercolor in her memory. She thought of the child she had lost, a tiny, silent bleeding that Cyrus had dismissed as woman's trouble. No, she would not die here. Not for Silas, not for Cyrus, not for any of them. Clara pushed herself up, a raw sob tearing at her frozen throat. She got to her hands and knees. The world was a white void. She didn't know which way she was going. She had been following a creek bed, but it was long gone, buried under drifts as tall as a man. She pushed herself to her feet. She took one step, and then another. The cold was inside her now, a brittle thing in her bones. She couldn't feel the ground. She was walking on air, on nothing. She saw a shape ahead, a darker line against the white. Trees? A trail? She lunged for it, a new desperate hope flaring. She made it 10 more steps before her vision blurred, the trees dissolving into gray shadows. Her body, pushed past all endurance, simply stopped. She didn't fall so much as fold, collapsing into the snow near what might have been an old trapper's trail, though no one had used it in years. The wind, indifferent, began its work of covering her, dusting her dark coat with a shroud of white. Luke Remy bowed his head, letting the wide brim of his hat take the worst of the wind. His horse, a sturdy gray gelding named Boulder, snorted and tossed its head, ice clinging to its mane. "I know, boy," Luke muttered, his voice ripped away by the gale. "Home soon." He hated this weather. It reminded him of the war, of the bitter cold in the mountain passes, the frozen bodies stacked like cordwood. He'd left the cavalry 10 years back and had never once looked behind him. He'd come here, to the high lonesome of Montana, to be left alone. He'd built his cabin with his own hands, thick logs chinked tight against this very wind. He trapped, he hunted, he kept to himself. The world could burn for all he cared. He was heading back from checking his trap lines, a meager haul of 3 rabbits slung over his saddle. He was already thinking of the stove, of hot coffee, of the silence of his one room. Boulder shied suddenly, pulling hard to the left and nearly unseating him. "Whoa, easy. What is it?" Luke reined him in, peering through the blinding snow. He saw nothing, just white and the dark, skeletal shapes of the pines. He nudged the horse forward, but Boulder resisted, sidestepping and blowing hard. "Fine," Luke was annoyed. "An animal, maybe a wolf or a cat pushed down from the high country by the storm." He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, his gloved hand resting on the cold steel. Then he saw it. A patch of dark color, almost black against the snow. It was snagged on a low branch, flapping wildly. A woman's shawl. Luke's gut tightened. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep. He moved toward the shawl, his eyes scanning the ground. He saw the glove a few feet away, half buried, fingers curled inward. He looked around. A slight depression, a disturbance in the snow that the storm hadn't yet erased. He followed it, his heart a dull, heavy thud in his chest. 10 paces later, he found her. She was almost completely covered, just a heap of snow with a tangle of dark hair visible at one end. He swore, a short, sharp curse. He knelt, pushing the snow away from her face. She was young, pale as marble. Ice was frozen on her eyelashes, her lips a faint, terrifying blue. He put his bare fingers to her neck, under her jaw, fumbling against the frozen skin. He waited. Nothing. He pressed harder. A pulse, faint, thready, as fragile as a moth's wing. But it was there. He looked around, up at the screaming, empty sky. Damn it. He had come here to be free of this, free of other people, of their troubles, of their dying. He was a good 2 miles from his cabin. The horse could barely carry them both in this. He looked down at her face. She was nobody, just another soul lost in the unforgiving land. He could walk away. By morning, she would be gone. It would be a kindness. Maybe. He couldn't do it. He had seen too much death. He wouldn't be the one to leave a body to the cold when there was still a spark in it. With a groan, he scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of ice and sticks. He hauled her to the horse, slinging her over the saddle, and then mounted behind her, pulling her back against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, trying to shield her with his own body, and kicked Boulder into a desperate, plodding walk. The cabin was nestled in a mountain hollow, protected on 3 sides by high rock walls and a stand of ancient pine. It was built to survive. The walls were thick timber, the roof low-pitched and heavy, designed to hold the weight of many feet of snow. A thin plume of gray smoke vanished instantly from the chimney, torn apart by the wind. Luke slid off the horse, his legs stiff. He pulled the woman down. Carrying her in his arms, he kicked the door open and half fell inside, into the sudden, shocking warmth. He laid her on the floor, on the bearskin rug near the stove, and slammed the door shut. The wind's scream was instantly muffled, reduced to a dull roar, a beast clawing at the walls. The cabin was one room. In the corner, the black iron stove radiated a deep, steady heat. A cot was built against one wall, a rough table and 2 chairs in the middle. Shelves lined another wall, holding tins of food, books, traps, and tools. It was neat, sparse, and safe. He didn't look at her face. He couldn't. He worked with a grim, impersonal efficiency. He pulled off her frozen boots, her feet like blocks of wood. He unbuttoned her coat, the thin fabric stiff as a board. Her dress beneath was damp. She was shaking now, a violent, uncontrollable shuddering as the warmth began to penetrate. He hesitated for only a second. He'd seen men freeze. He knew what had to be done. He unbuttoned her dress and, keeping his eyes averted, pulled it off, along with the damp chemise beneath. He left her in her thin woolen stockings and drawers. He grabbed the thickest quilts from his cot, wrapped her tightly, and lifted her. Placing her on the cot, he piled more blankets on top of her, tucking them in until she was a mound of wool and cotton. He stoked the fire, adding logs until the stove roared, then put a pot of water on to heat. He rubbed his own face, the skin numb from the ride. He sat at the table, his back to the cot, and waited. Clara drifted. She was warm. It was the first thing she knew, a deep, impossible warmth that soaked into her bones. She was in her bed at home, as a child, her mother tucking the blankets under her chin. But then the warmth became a fire, a burning, and she heard a sound, a terrible, high-pitched scream. The wind. Her eyes snapped open. The ceiling was low, made of dark, heavy logs. The light was dim, orange. She smelled wood smoke and coffee. She was in a bed, not her bed. She was buried under a mountain of blankets. She turned her head. A man sat at a table, his back to her. He was large, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark wool shirt. A rifle leaned against the wall near him. The panic was a cold, sharp blade under her ribs. Silas. He had found her. He had dragged her here. But this wasn't the ranch. It was smaller. A trap. She threw the blankets off, her body screaming in protest. The air was warm, but her skin prickled. She tried to stand. Her legs buckled instantly. She fell to her knees beside the cot, the rough floorboards biting into her skin. The man turned. It wasn't Silas. This man was a stranger. His face was hard, angular, covered in a dark, untrimmed beard. His eyes, in the dim light, were watchful and still. "No," Clara whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She scrambled, trying to crawl. "Please, no!" She had to get out. She had traded one cage for another. She lunged for the door, a heavy plank of wood with a thick iron bar across it. She got 2 steps, her body utterly betraying her, and collapsed onto the floor, so weak she could barely lift her head. She lay there, trembling, waiting for the heavy boot, the rough hand. Luke watched her. He didn't move from his chair. He had seen that kind of fear before, in spooked horses, in men new to the line. He let the panic run its course. When she was still, sobbing quietly into the floorboards, he stood. She flinched, curling into herself. He walked past her, to the stove. He ladled something from a pot into a tin cup. Broth. He had heated the rabbit stock. He walked back and crouched near her, but kept his distance, a good 3 feet between them. He set the cup on the floor, just within her reach. "You're safe here." His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first time he had spoken to her. Clara stared at the cup, then at his boots. She couldn't look at his face. Safe. Silas had said she was safe. Cyrus had said he would keep her safe. The word was a lie. "Drink this," he said. He wasn't asking. "There's a blizzard out there that'll strip the meat from your bones in a minute. You'll freeze no good to me or yourself." His tone wasn't kind. It was practical. It was the sound of a man stating a fact. He wasn't trying to soothe her, and that, strangely, made her fear lessen, just a fraction. He wasn't handling her. Slowly, her hands shaking so hard she could barely grip the cup. She reached for it. She brought it to her lips and drank. The broth was hot, salty, and rich. It burned a line of pure life down her throat, into her empty, frozen stomach. She drank it all, greedily. When she was done, she looked up. He was still watching her, his face unreadable. "More," she whispered. He nodded. He took the cup, refilled it, and handed it to her. He didn't try to help her up. He let her drink it, huddled on the floor. When she was finished with the second cup, some strength had returned. He gestured to the cot. "Get in. You'll catch your death on the floor." She looked down, realizing she was in her underthings. A flush of shame burned her neck. He seemed not to notice, or not to care. He turned his back to her, adding another log to the stove. Clara scrambled back onto the cot, pulling the heavy blankets up to her chin. He was right. The floor was cold. He was right. The storm was a monster. He hadn't hurt her. He had given her broth. He brought her clothes, which he'd hung near the stove to dry. "They're warm," he said, and dropped them at the foot of the cot. He went back to his chair. She dressed under the covers, her fingers clumsy and stiff. The wool was coarse against her skin, but it was warm. She sat up, clutching the blankets around her. Hours passed. The cabin grew darker as the snow piled up against the single, small window. The only light came from the orange glow of the stove's grate. The wind was a constant, physical presence, a ceaseless assault on the small building. Clara's mind cleared. The delirium was gone, replaced by a deep, aching weariness and a sharp, wary alertness. She watched the man. He cleaned his rifle. He sharpened a knife. He sat and stared into the fire. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. The silence was heavier than the blankets. "Where am I?" she finally asked. Her voice sounded thin in the small space. He looked over his shoulder. "Wind River Range, my cabin." "Who are you?" "Luke Remy." He offered nothing more. She waited. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she was doing out in a blizzard. This silence was different from the one at the ranch. The demanding, prying silence of her in-laws, who were always watching, judging. This was just emptiness. It was a void that she felt a strange need to fill, if only to prove that she was still there. You saved me," she said. "Found you," he corrected, as if saving was too personal a word. "Couldn't leave you. Why?" He stopped his work, turning to look at her fully. His eyes were gray. She saw now, and tired. "Does it matter?" No, I suppose not." She looked down at her hands. "My name is Clara. Clara Wynne." He gave a single, short nod. "Clara." He said the name. It felt strange to hear it spoken by this man, in this tiny, storm-locked room. "You live here alone?" she asked, pulling the blanket tighter. "I do." "For how long?" He seemed to consider whether to answer. "Since I left the cavalry. 10 years. You were a soldier. I was—" His voice was flat, closing the subject. He turned back to his table. She watched his broad back. He was a man of few words, and she was grateful for it. Words had been weapons where she came from. Every question from Silas was a hook, every statement a trap. This man's silence was a wall, and for now, she was glad to be behind it. "I was running," she said, the confession spilling into the quiet. He didn't turn around. He just paused, his hands still. "Most folks out here are running from something." The cabin was small. She measured it with her eyes. Maybe 15 paces long, 10 wide. Her cot was in one corner, the stove in another. His few possessions were neat, stacked with a soldier's precision. The space was shrinking. Every breath he took seemed to fill the room, to use up the air. The smell of him, wood smoke, coffee, and something else, something sharp and male, like leather and cold iron, was everywhere. Outside, the wind rose to a new, frantic pitch, and a heavy branch cracked and fell onto the roof with a thud that made Clara jump. Luke was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, his body coiled. He moved to the door, listening. He stood there for a full minute, head cocked, before he relaxed, lowering the rifle. "Just the wind." He saw her watching him, her eyes wide. He set the rifle back in its place. He moved to the stove and ladled a thick stew of beans and jerky into 2 bowls. He handed one to her. She took it, her stomach cramping with hunger. They ate in silence. The only sounds, the scrape of spoons against tin and the roar of the storm. The wind, she thought. sounded like a predator, circling, testing the walls, demanding to be let in. They were pinned. Two strangers, trapped in a box of wood while the world tried to tear it apart. When they finished, she knew she had to ask. She couldn't go back, but she couldn't stay here. This man was a stranger. He was large and armed, but the storm was worse. "Mr. Remy," she began, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Luke, Luke." She took a breath. I can't go back out there. Not yet. The storm." She hated how weak she sounded, but it was the simple truth. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the stove's grate. The firelight cast shadows across his hard features. She thought he was going to tell her to leave. She thought he would throw her back out into the white. "Storm like this'll hold for days," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "Maybe a week." He stood and walked to the window, scraping a small patch of ice away with his thumbnail. He stared out into the solid, swirling blackness. "You can stay," he said, his back still to her, "until it breaks." Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Relief washed over her, so profound it made her dizzy. "Thank you. I can work. I can cook or mend." He turned around, and his face was hard. "But," the word hung in the air. "This is my home," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "I keep it quiet. You pull your weight. You don't." He hesitated, searching for the word. "You don't make trouble." He pointed to the cot. "That's yours. I'll take the floor." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. It was a bargain, not a kindness. That, she understood. She could earn her keep. "Thank you," she whispered again. The tension in the room had changed. It was no longer just the storm. It was the two of them, a man and a woman, alone, in a small, dim space. He had given her shelter, but he had also drawn a line. He turned away from her, went to a chest, and pulled out a rolled blanket and a thin mattress. He spread it on the floor, on the other side of the stove, as far from her cot as the room would allow. He sat on his makeshift bed and began pulling off his boots. His back was to her. It was the clearest boundary of all. The air between them, across the small, warm space, began to simmer. The morning light was a weak, gray smear against the single frosted window. The wind had not lessened. It had settled into a steady, freight train roar that vibrated in the logs of the cabin. Clara woke stiffly on the cot. Luke was already up, his bedroll neatly tied and stowed in the corner. He was at the stove, pouring coffee into his tin cup. The smell filled the small room, cutting through the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. She sat up, pulling the blankets around her. She was hungry. Her body ached, and she felt the deep, bone-weary shame of her weakness. She was a burden. She had stayed on his terms. "You pull your weight. The stove is low," she said, her voice rough from sleep. Luke glanced over his shoulder. He did not seem surprised she was awake. "There's logs in the box. I'm checking the horse." He pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed his rifle, and ducked out the door. A wall of swirling white and bitter cold blasting into the room for the second he was gone. Clara threw off the blankets. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. Her own coat was useless. She fed logs into the stove until the flames licked the iron. She found the water bucket nearly empty, with only a skin of ice on the bottom. She looked at the pot of snow melting on the stovetop. That was their water. A slow, tedious process. She found a broom and swept the floor, tidying the dirt he had tracked in, arranging the two chairs back at the small table. She found his meager supplies on the shelf: a sack of flour, half a bag of beans, salt, coffee, and some dried jerky. It was a soldier's larder. She organized it, taking inventory. It was not much. Not for two people, for a week. When Luke returned, his eyebrows and beard were white with frost. He kicked the snow off his boots by the door, his face grim. The lean-to held, he said, pulling off his gloves. But the wind's packing snow in the gaps. Boulder's restless. He needs care. Clara said. Luke looked at her, surprised. You know horses? My father raised them. Before. She did not say before what. Before the drought took the farm. Before she was married off to Cyrus. He doesn't like strangers, Luke warned. A hand with feet in it is no stranger. Luke considered her. He gave a short nod. Get your coat. He did not have one to offer her. She put on her own threadbare coat and the shawl, wrapping it tight around her head. He led the way, a rope tied from the cabin to the small lean-to 20 yards away, a lifeline in the whiteout. The wind was staggering. She kept her head down, following his heavy boots. The horse, Boulder, was a gray shape in the gloom of the three-sided shed. He whinnied, a high, nervous sound. When Clara entered, Luke went straight to the horse's head, murmuring low, calming sounds, his hand stroking the thick neck. Easy, boy, easy. Clara kept her distance. She saw the bucket of feed. She scooped a measure and held it out on her flat palm. It's all right, she said, her voice soft, the tone she's used to use with her father's skittish colts. No one is going to hurt you. The horse's ears flickered. He eyed her, then Luke, then bent his head and snuffled at her hand, his lips warm and velvety as he took the grain. Luke watched, his expression hidden in the shadows. You've got the touch, he said. It was almost a compliment. He's just cold, Clara replied, rubbing the horse's broad forehead. And lonely. They worked together, Luke forking hay into the manger while Clara broke the ice in the water trough and refilled it with snow. They repacked the gaps in the lean-to walls with handfuls of straw and snow, a temporary chinking against the wind. Their hands, one pair bare and blue-white, the other in thick leather gloves, often brushed as they worked. They did not speak. They did not need to. It was the rhythm of survival, a shared task that bound them. Back in the cabin, the warmth was a blessing. They spent the rest of the day in the small domestic dance. He split logs from a small pile he kept inside, the sharp thwack of the axe, a counter-rhythm to the wind. She stacked the wood, melted snow for water, and boiled beans, adding jerky and salt to make a thick, hot stew. She found a needle and thread in his kit and mended the tear in his canvas jacket. He sat at the table, oiling his rifle. The scrape of the cloth and the click of the metal, the only sounds. They moved around each other in the 10 feet of open space, a careful, respectful distance. But the cabin was too small for distance. He was aware of the curve of her back as she bent over the fire. She was aware of the breadth of his shoulders as he worked. It was an intimacy of shared air, shared warmth, shared necessity. The storm did not break. It held for a second day, and a third. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. The gray light of morning blurred into the orange-lit dark of evening. The howl of the wind the only measure of time. At night, after the meager stew was eaten, the silence stretched. Luke sat on his bedroll, his back against the wall, sharpening his trapping knife. Clara sat on the cot, her hands busy mending her own torn dress. The cavalry, she said on the 3rd night, her voice quiet. Where did you serve? Luke's hands stilled. He looked into the fire. Kansas, Arizona territories, chased ghosts. Ghosts! Apaches, Comanche, men who knew the land better than we knew ourselves. He tested the blade against his thumb. It was hard country. Is that why you came here? This is hard country, too. This country is quiet, he said. The land is honest. It tries to kill you, but it doesn't lie about it. He ran the whetstone down the blade again. The war... That was different. Clara waited. The silence of the cabin invited confession. We were chasing a small band of Chiricahua, he said, his voice low, almost talking to himself. Up in the Dragoons. We were cold, hungry, colder than this. We tracked them for 3 weeks. He stopped. What happened? She whispered. We found them. Not warriors, old men, women, children, hiding in a dry canyon. He set the stone down. The captain gave the order. We... It was not a fight. It was a slaughter." He stared at his hands, as if seeing the blood on them. "I saw things. I did things." Clara watched his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the deep sadness in his eye. "I never went home after that," he said. "My folks had a farm in Ohio. I was supposed to take it over." He shook his head. The man who left that farm, he wasn't the one coming back. That man was gone, buried in the desert. He fell silent, the weight of his words settling in the small room. He had shared his ghosts, and now they sat between them, sharing the fire. Clara felt a strange answering pull, a need to match his honesty. The things she held inside her, the things she had never spoken aloud, felt heavy. "My husband, Cyrus," she started, and her voice shook. She stopped. Luke did not press. He just waited, his gray eyes on her. "He was not a kind man," she said, looking at her own hands, twisting the thread. "He was hard. He drank. His hands were heavy." She did not need to say more. Luke understood. "After a year, I was with child." A small, secret smile touched her lips, just for a second. "I was happy. I thought it would make things better, make him softer." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was 5 months along." He came home one night from the saloon. He was angry about money, angry about the mine. He hit me in the stomach, hard. She was quiet for a long moment, the wind scream filling the space. "I lost the baby," she whispered. "A little girl. I buried her myself, out by the creek, while he was sleeping it off. He never even asked. He told me to stop my crying, that it was just woman's trouble, and that I was no good to him in bed if I was bleeding." A single tear tracked down her face. She wiped it away angrily. "When the mine collapsed and took him, I did not cry. I felt nothing, just empty. I thought I was free." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "But his brother, Silas, he owned the debt. He owned the ranch. And he said he owned me. He said I was property, just like the house, just like the horse." She looked at Luke, her gaze defiant and terrified. "That's why I ran. He came to my room. I hit him and I ran." Luke said nothing. He absorbed her story, his face a mask of stone. The fire crackled. He had seen the ugliness of men in war. She had seen it in her own home. The 4th day. The confinement began to press on Clara. The walls felt closer. The ceiling felt lower. The relentless, screaming wind was no longer just a sound. It was the sound of Silas. It was the sound of her own trapped, silent scream. She was trying to make bread, a poor mix of flour and water. She kneaded it on the small table, but her hands were shaking. The wind hit the cabin with a sudden, violent gust that rattled the door in its frame. Clara cried out, a small, choked sound. The wooden bowl slipped from her numb fingers and crashed to the floor, shattering into 3 pieces. The dough, their precious food, was ruined in the dirt. She stared at it, the waste, the noise, the trap. "No," she whispered. "No, please, no!" She slid to the floor, her back against the wall, and buried her face in her hands. It was not a gentle weeping. It was a breakdown, a dry, racking series of sobs that shook her entire body. The cold, the fear, the grief for her child, the terror of Silas, and the claustrophobia of the tiny, dark cabin. It all came crashing down. She wrapped her arms around her head, trying to block out the sound of the wind, the sound of her own failure. Luke was on his feet in an instant. He took 1 step toward her, his hand outstretched, then stopped. He saw the terror in her posture. He remembered her flinching when he first found her. He knew this was not a hurt he could fix with a touch. Her pain was from hands. He pulled his chair from the table, his one chair, and moved it across the room. He sat down, a few feet away from her, his rifle laid across his lap. He did not speak. He did not try to comfort her. He just sat. He sat there as she cried, his presence a solid, unmoving thing in the chaotic room. He was a guard. He was a wall. He was just there. He was not demanding anything of her. He was not trying to stop her. He was letting the storm inside her rage, just as the storm outside did. It felt like an hour. Her sobs slowly quieted, turning into shaky, hitching breaths. The storm in her passed, leaving an exhausted, aching calm. She finally lowered her hands, her face blotchy and wet, her eyes raw. She looked at him, her gaze full of shame. I'm sorry. The bowl. Luke shook his head. It was an old bowl. He stood, not offering a hand to help her up. He respected her enough to let her find her own feet. He went to the corner, got the small broom, and began sweeping up the broken pieces of pottery and the dirty dough. He did not make her do it. He dumped the mess into the fire, where it sizzled and smoked. That evening, the silence was different. It was not tense. It was settled. The storm had broken in her, and he had stayed. The wind had died down slightly, and the snow had stopped. A heavy, profound stillness settled over the world. They stood side by side at the small window, scraping at the thick frost. They could see almost nothing, just the faint gray light of dusk on a world buried in white. The quiet was a relief. Luke looked at the window, but he was seeing her story. He had been thinking about it all day, about the child she buried alone, about the man who called her property. "You don't deserve the things done to you," he said. His voice was quiet, but the words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was not pity. It was a statement of fact, a judgment. He was not absolving her. He was accusing the world that had harmed her. Clara's throat tightened. She could not speak. She just nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. But this time, they were quiet. She looked at his reflection in the icy glass, this hard, silent man, and felt a rush of warmth, of gratitude so fierce it stole her breath. Later, the cold of the night began to seep into the cabin. The fire had burned low while they stood at the window. Clara, lost in thought, had let it die down. She stood near the door, feeling the draft, and shivered, rubbing her arms. Luke saw the tremor. He said nothing. He stood, walked to the peg by the door, and took down his own heavy coat. It was lined with sheepskin, worn and heavy, smelling of pine smoke and the cold, clean air of the mountains. She thought he was going outside. Instead, he walked up behind her. He did not hand her the coat. He draped it over her shoulders, his movements sure and impersonal. But the coat was heavy, and his hands were large. As he settled it around her, his calloused fingers brushed the side of her neck, just below her ear. The touch was electric. It was the first human touch she had felt in years that was not violent or cold. It was just warmth. His hand lingered on her shoulder for half a second, a moment of possession that was not about ownership, but about protection. Clara's hand came up, intending to pull the collar closed, and her fingers brushed the back of his. They both froze. The air in the cabin crackled. The 10 feet of space between their beds vanished. There was only the scrape of his skin against hers, the sudden, shared heat. She could feel his breath on her hair. He could smell the faint scent of wood smoke on her skin. Desire, sudden and sharp as a shard of ice, shot through both of them. It was a jolt of life, a hunger for warmth in the endless cold. Luke pulled his hand away as if burned. He stepped back, his voice gruff to cover the tremor in it. "You'll catch a chill. Stove's low." He turned away from her, moving quickly to the woodpile, his back rigid. He began feeding logs into the fire with short, angry movements. He was a man haunted by what his hands had done in the past, a man who believed he did not deserve softness. Clara stood frozen by the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She clutched the coat, pulling it tight. It was still warm from his body. She was trembling, but not from the cold. Her body, so long braced for pain, was terrified of this new, strange, aching need. She associated this feeling with Cyrus, with Silas, with fear. That night, The tension was a new, living thing in the room. He lay on his bedroll, his back turned pointedly toward her. She lay on the cot, wrapped in his coat, burying her face in the sheepskin collar. She breathed in his scent, a scent of safety and solitude, and felt a longing so deep it frightened her. They were two souls, haunted by their pasts, trapped in the eye of the storm. They had retreated to opposite ends of the room, but the space between them had never felt so small. On the morning of the 5th day, the sound woke them. It was the silence. The steady, maddening scream of the wind had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, muffled stillness that felt unnatural. The cabin, which had seemed a fortress against the noise, now felt like a tomb. Clara sat up on the cot, the tension of the past few days still coiled in her shoulders. Luke was already at the window, scraping away the thick frost. A brighter, gray light spilled in, illuminating the fine layer of dust on the floor. "It stopped," she said, her voice small in the new quiet. "For now." Luke turned from the window, and the light caught his face. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes tight. The air between them was still charged from the night before, from the moment his fingers had brushed her skin, from the shared, unspoken jolt of desire. They had been careful around each other all morning, their movements stiff, their words clipped and practical. "Supplies are low," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. He did not look at her as he spoke. "The rabbits in the pantry are gone. We need meat." He checked his rifle, his movements economical and precise. He strapped a sheathed knife to his belt and pulled his hat down low. Clara felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear. It was different from the fear she'd felt of Silas. This was the fear of being alone. The cabin, her shelter, would become a cage if he left. "It's safe." "It's never safe," he said. "But it's quiet, and we have to eat." He looked at her then, his gray eyes direct. "I'll be back before dark. Keep the door barred. Don't go out. For any reason, stoke the fire before you run low on wood." He was gone. The heavy door thudded shut, and the bar dropped into its bracket from the outside. She was alone, locked in. She listened to the silence. It was broken only by the crackle of the stove and the faint, restless stamp of boulder in the nearby lean-to. She set about her chores, but her hands shook. She swept the floor, melted snow for water, and tidied their few supplies. But her mind was outside, in the white. Every small sound, the settling of the roof under the heavy snow, the drip of meltwater from the eaves, made her jump. Luke moved through a world remade. The snow was immense, piled in drifts as high as his head, sculpting the landscape into soft, alien shapes. The air was bitingly cold, sharp and clean in his lungs. It felt good to be moving. The cabin had become too small, too full of her scent, of the memory of her skin. He moved with a hunter's quiet, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. A track, a broken branch. The world was pristine, a blank, white page. He checked his trap lines first, following the ridge. It was a long, hard walk, his boots sinking deep with every step. The first 2 traps were empty, buried deep. The third held a small fox, frozen solid, its fur stiff with ice. It was something, but not enough. He reset the traps, his fingers growing numb in his gloves, and moved on, pushing further, toward the old, buried trapper's trail where he had found Clara. He found the tracks near the mouth of his hollow, where the trees thinned. They were not animal tracks. Luke crouched, his body going perfectly still. He was a soldier again. The man who hunted rabbits was gone. He studied them. 3 men, heavy boots, worn at the heels. They had come down from the east ridge, following the path of least resistance. They had stood here, looking down toward his hollow, toward the cabin, marked only by the thin ribbon of smoke they must have seen. He brushed the snow away. The tracks were fresh, made within the last day. During the height of the storm, they were scouting. They had come close, tasted the wind, and decided to wait for the weather to break. They had not come down, not yet. A cold, hard knot formed in Luke's stomach. This was not the law. The law didn't travel in blizzards. This was something else. He thought of Clara, her haunted eyes, her story. He said he owned me. Silas. Luke stood, his eyes scanning the silent, snow-covered ridges that surrounded his home. They were out there, waiting, or worse, coming back. He abandoned the hunt. He turned and walked back to the cabin, his long strides eating up the distance. He was no longer a trapper. He was a sentry. He moved through the trees, keeping to the cover, his rifle off his shoulder and in his hands. Clara heard the bar lift. The door opened, and he was back. It had been only 2 hours. He carried no game, only the small, frozen fox. His face was a mask, hard and shut. "What is it?" she asked, her hand at her throat. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said, his voice flat. He dropped the fox by the door. "Wind's picking up. Decided not to risk it?" It was a lie. She knew it instantly. The air outside was perfectly still. He did not take off his coat. He walked past her and fetched the heavy bar of wood he used to brace the door during the worst of the storms, the one he had not used in days. He set it, lodging it between the door and a cleat in the floor. He went to the window and stared out, not at the view, but at the ridges. "Luke," she said, her voice trembling. "You're frightening me." He turned. "Good. Be frightened." He went to the woodpile inside the cabin, picked up his axe, and went back out. She watched through the window as he walked to the main pile, hidden under a tarp, and began to chop. He worked with a fierce, controlled energy, the thwack of the axe echoing in the hollow. He was not just chopping wood for the night. He was building a fortress. He made 4 trips, piling the wood high against the inside wall, until the box was overflowing. He came back in, his breathing heavy, but not from exertion. He was angry. He set 2 new traps, small, vicious-looking things with iron teeth, just outside the door, buried in the snow near the path to the lean-to. Clara watched him, her heart sinking. He was preparing for a siege. "They're coming for me." "Aren't they?" she whispered, her voice dead. "He found me." Luke stopped. He looked at her, his face grim. "I found tracks. 3 men. They were scouting the hollow." He looked at the door. "They'll be back." The rest of the day passed in a new, terrible silence. The tension of desire was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp tension of fear. Every time the roof creaked, they both tensed. Luke sat at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle, which was already clean. Clara tried to cook the fox, but her hands shook so badly she spilled the water. Late in the afternoon, the water bucket ran dry. Melting snow was too slow. They needed water, and they needed it now. "I'll go to the river," Luke said, standing. He grabbed his rifle and the 2 wooden buckets. "I'll come with you," Clara said. She stood, her own fear warring with her guilt. He was doing this to protect her. She would not hide while he took the risks. "I can carry one." Luke looked at her, ready to refuse. He saw the resolve in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had when she spoke of her husband. He couldn't leave her alone, and he couldn't argue. He needed to be quick. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say." The walk to the river was short, maybe 200 yards through the trees. The river was a slash of black, angry water in the white snow. The storm had choked it, and the edges were thick with ice, but the center ran fast and dark. The cold was biting, and the sun was already touching the tops of the western ridge, painting the snow in pale shades of orange and blue. "Stay on the bank," Luke ordered, his voice low. He scanned the trees on the far side. "Wait here." He moved carefully down to the edge. The ice groaned under his weight. He found a spot where the current ran clear, smashed a hole with his heel, and dipped the first bucket. Clara watched, shivering, her eyes darting between Luke and the shadows under the pines. She hated this. She hated feeling useless. "I can get the second one," she said, moving forward. "Clara, no! Stay back!" She had already taken a step down the bank. She didn't see the patch of black ice hidden beneath a thin dusting of snow. Her foot slipped. She threw her hands out, grabbing for a purchase that wasn't there. With a small, startled cry, she tumbled forward, sliding past Luke and into the freezing, dark water. The shock was total. It was not cold. It was a physical, crushing blow. The water was a solid thing, stealing her breath, squeezing her chest in a vice. Her heavy clothes, the coat Luke had given her, instantly became a lead weight, dragging her down. The current grabbed her, pulling her under the ice shelf. She saw a flash of orange light, the sky, and then blackness. Luke roared. It was not a word, but a sound of pure, primal rage. He did not hesitate. He dropped the bucket, dropped his rifle, and dove. He lunged for the dark shape of her head, grabbing a handful of her hair and her coat. The water was so cold it burned his skin. 1,000 needles of fire. His boots found no purchase on the slick, rocky bottom. The current was powerful, sucking them both under the ice. He kicked hard, turning his body, and slammed his elbow into the ice shelf, shattering it. He roared again, fighting the water, fighting the cold that was already trying to stop his heart. He got a hand on a thick root growing from the bank and held on, the current tearing at them. He hauled Clara up, pulling her against his chest. She was a dead weight, her head lolling, water streaming from her blue lips. He dragged her onto the bank, her body leaving a dark, wet smear on the snow. He didn't stop. He didn't check her. He knew he had seconds. He threw her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and sprinted. He left the buckets. He left his rifle. He ran, crashing through the snow-laden branches. His only thought the cabin, the fire. He kicked the door open, nearly tearing it from its hinges, and threw Clara onto the bearskin rug in front of the stove. She was shivering, a violent, uncontrollable shuddering that seemed to rack her entire body. Her teeth were chattering, a rapid, desperate click, click, click. Her lips were blue, her skin a waxy, terrifying white. Luke knew this cold. He had seen it take men in the mountains, men who sat down to rest and never got up. The fire was not enough. It was too slow. "Clara!" he yelled, his voice cracking. He knelt beside her, his own hands shaking. "Clara, stay with me." He didn't wait for an answer. His hands went to her clothes. The buttons were frozen. Impossible. He pulled his knife from his belt. He sliced through the front of his own heavy coat that she wore, cutting the wool and sheepskin. He ripped it off her. Her dress beneath was plastered to her skin, stiff with ice. He cut it from the neck to the hem and tore it from her body, her underthings, her chemise, her stockings. He cut and ripped, his movements frantic, desperate. She lay naked on the rug, a pale, shivering thing, curled into a ball. She was dying. Luke stood and stripped his own clothes, his coat, his shirt, his boots. His own long johns were soaked and freezing. He tore them off until he, too, was naked, his skin red and raw from the cold. He half dragged, half lifted her from the floor to the cot. He threw the heavy blankets open, pushed her in, and got in behind her. He pulled her back against his chest, her icy, trembling back pressed tight against his bare stomach and chest. He wrapped his legs around her frozen thighs, his arms like steel bands around her waist. It was a shock. Her skin was so cold it felt like holding a corpse. He flinched, but he held her tighter. "Hold on," he growled into her wet hair. "Breathe. You have to breathe." Clara was barely conscious. She was in a dark, cold place, the sound of the river in her ears. Then, pain, a burning, searing heat that wrapped around her. She tried to pull away, a small, animal whimper in her throat. This was wrong. This was a man. This was fear. But her body, in its last, desperate instinct for survival, betrayed her. It leaned into the heat. His skin was a furnace. His arms were a vice, crushing her, but they were warm. The shivering, which had felt like it would tear her apart, continued, but now she was shivering against him. Luke held her, his entire body trembling. He was cold, but it was more than that. The feel of her, the absolute, terrifying vulnerability of her, the soft, smooth skin of her back, the curve of her hip pressed into his, the weight of her head under his chin. He had never in his life felt anything so fragile or so powerful. He rubbed her arms, her legs, his hands rough, trying to force friction, to force life back into her limbs. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely control them. This was not the gentle touch of the night before. This was a desperate, raw fight. He was fighting the cold, and he was fighting himself. Every instinct, every lonely, starved part of him wanted to turn this into something else. He wanted to pull her under him, to possess this warmth. He closed his eyes, his teeth grinding. No, out of respect. He was saving her, not taking her. He held her still, his grip iron, and poured his own life, his own heat, into her. For a long time, the only sounds in the cabin were the roar of the stove and the violent, rhythmic chatter of her teeth. Then, slowly, the rhythm changed. The shudders that shook her became less violent. The chattering of her teeth eased. Her breathing, which had been in short, panicked gasps, deepened. It hitched, and then, with a long, shuddering sigh, she went limp, her body sinking back against his. She was not unconscious. She was, for the first time, not fighting. Her shivering was a tremor, no longer a storm. She was warm, damp, alive. He felt the change. The moment the life settled back into her, his own trembling eased, but his arms did not loosen. He could feel her heart beating, a steady, faint rhythm against his own ribs. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, river water, and pine. He was exhausted. They lay like that for an hour. The cabin grew dark. The firelight painted the walls red. That night, after they had dressed in dry clothes and eaten a silent meal of broth, the air in the cabin was different. It was not fear, and it was not desire. It was a thick, heavy intimacy that neither of them knew how to break. The line had been obliterated. He had held her, skin to skin. He had saved her life. She sat on the cot, wrapped in all the blankets. He sat on his bedroll across the room, staring into the fire. "I forgot," Clara said, her voice quiet, rough from the cold. Luke looked up. She was looking at the fire, not at him. "I forgot what it felt like," she whispered, "to be held, without fear." She turned her head, and her eyes met his. They were clear and deep, and held no terror. "I was so cold, but I knew, even when you were cutting my clothes, I knew you wouldn't hurt me. I was afraid of dying. I wasn't afraid of you." Luke's throat felt thick. He looked down at his own hands, the hands he had always seen as weapons, as tools of death. Tonight, they had given life. He had spent 10 years believing he was a poison, a man who had fled the world so he wouldn't stain it. "I forgot," he said, his voice a low gravel, "what it meant to care." He looked at her, and the words were a confession, heavier than the one about the war. "I didn't care if I lived or died, and I didn't care about anyone else. Until you." The silence in the room was absolute. She had offered him trust. He had offered her the truth. He stood from his bedroll. He crossed the small space, the 4 steps that had been a chasm between them. He sat on the edge of her cot. She did not flinch. She did not pull the blankets higher. She just watched him. He raised one hand, the one that still trembled, and touched her face. His calloused thumb brushed her cheek, which was still pink from the cold. She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, a small, trusting movement that broke something inside him. He leaned in. He was slow. He gave her every chance to turn away. She did not. His lips touched hers. It was hesitant. It was slow. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It tasted of salt and wood smoke and a decade of loneliness. It was a shared breath, a question asked and answered. "Are you here? Yes. Am I? Yes." The kiss deepened, just for a second. The warmth, the softness of her mouth, the small sigh she gave. It ignited the hunger he had been fighting. He felt her hand come up, her fingers light on his arm. He broke it. He pulled back, his breath ragged. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. It was too much. She was alive because of him. He would not take advantage of that. He would not take advantage of her gratitude or her fear of the men outside. "Luke," she whispered, her voice confused. "Not like this," he said, his voice thick. He pulled away, standing up. "Not when you're scared. Not when they're out there." He turned and went back to his own bedroll, his back to her. The emotional connection was a steel band, forged in ice and fire. They had touched, they had confessed, they had sealed something. But the physical boundary, rebuilt this time not out of fear, but out of a deep and painful respect, remained. For now, the kiss and his retreat changed the air. The boundary he had drawn was one of respect, and that respect was a more powerful balm than any touch. The fear that had lived in Clara's belly for years, the constant, coiling serpent of anticipating a man's anger or his demands, was gone. She looked at Luke, his broad back turned to her as he sat by the fire, and she felt not a flicker of it. That night, the cold returned with a vengeance, a sharp, penetrating chill that the stove could not fully beat back. Clara lay on the cot, his heavy coat wrapped around her, but still she shivered. Luke, on his bedroll, was restless, the floorboards hard and cold. He sat up, the firelight catching the tired lines on his face. "This is foolish," he said, his voice low. She watched him. He stood, not with the abruptness of their first nights, but with a weary sigh. He picked up his bedroll, the one he had placed so deliberately on the far side of the room. He did not move it to her cot. He unrolled it right beside her, on the floor, his head level with her own. "The floor steals the heat," he said, a gruff explanation that was not the real reason. "This is warmer." She said nothing. She watched him lie down. A mountain of a man just inches away. He was on his back, staring at the log ceiling. She was on her side, facing him. They were separated by the small space, by the edge of her cot, but they were together. "Good night, Luke," she whispered. "Good night, Clara," he rumbled. She fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that was more comforting than the fire. The next morning, the fear of the trackers was still a sharp, metallic taste in the air, but inside the cabin, something had thawed. They moved around each other with a new, strange gentleness. The conversation, which had been halting and practical, became easier. He told her about the farm in Ohio, about the creek he used to fish in, the smell of his mother's bread. She told him about her father's horses, about a chestnut mare she had raised from a foal, how it would follow her like a dog. They talked about small things, pointless things, the kind of things people share when they are no longer just surviving, but living. They learned the landscape of each other's pasts, and they laughed. It was the 6th day. Clara had found a small, forgotten sack of cornmeal tucked in the back of a shelf. She was determined to make a real meal, not another pot of stringy rabbit stew. "I can make Johnny cakes," she announced, with a confidence she did not feel. Luke raised an eyebrow, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Can you now?" "My mother taught me. It's all in the wrist." She mixed the meal with water and salt, trying to remember the portions. She greased the skillet with the last of the bacon fat and dropped spoonfuls of the batter into the hot pan. The cabin filled with the smell of scorching. A thick, acrid smoke billowed from the skillet. She had made the pan too hot. "Oh, no!" she cried, fanning the smoke away with her apron. She tried to flip them, but they were blackened on the bottom and raw dough in the middle. A smoking, inedible mess. She looked at the skillet, then at Luke, her eyes wide with mortification, on the verge of tears. This one simple thing, this one way she could contribute, and she had failed. Luke looked at the charred pucks of cornmeal. He looked at her face smudged with soot, her lower lip trembling, and he laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound that started deep in his chest, a sound of pure, surprised delight. It was the sound of a man who had not laughed in 10 years. The sound was so unexpected it startled Clara. She looked at him, his shoulders shaking, his gray eyes crinkling, and a bubble of laughter rose in her own chest. She laughed, too, a high, clear sound of relief. She laughed until tears ran down her sooty cheeks. They stood in the smoky cabin, the ruined meal between them, and laughed until their sides ached. He was the first to stop, his laughter easing into a deep chuckle. He stepped forward, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. He raised one hand, his thumb gently wiping a tear, and the soot from her cheek. "I could get used to this," he said, his voice quiet. His hand lingered. The laughter faded, and the air between them grew thick again. But it was not the sharp desire of before. It was something deeper, something warmer. His eyes searched hers. He was not just talking about the laughter. He was talking about the smoke, the failure, the we, that night. The threat outside felt distant, a problem for the morning. The world had shrunk to the warm, firelit space, and the two of them, they sat, not in their separate places, but together on the bearskin rug in front of the stove. He had moved his bedroll there, and she had taken a blanket from the cot to join him. For a long time, they said nothing. The silence was full. The kiss by the cot had been a question. His retreat had been an answer. Not yet. Now. The air had changed. The laughter, his touch on her cheek, had changed it. He turned to her, the firelight painting his hard face in shadows and gold. He did not speak. He just held out his hand. Clara looked at his hand. It was large, calloused, scarred. It was the hand that had found her in the snow, the hand that had cut her free from the ice, the hand that had gently wiped the soot from her face. She put her own hand in his. He did not pull her. He just held her hand, his thumb rubbing slowly over her knuckles. He looked into her eyes, and his own were full of a raw, painful longing that matched her own. "Clara," he breathed, as if the name itself was a plea. She leaned in, and this time, she was the one who closed the distance. She kissed him. It was not hesitant. Not this time. It was a kiss of certainty, of starvation. It was the kiss of a woman who had been cold for years. He met her, his mouth claiming hers with a desperate, pent-up hunger that was both terrifying and thrilling. He tasted of coffee and wood smoke, and she could feel the rough scrape of his beard, a feeling that should have been frightening but was instead intensely real. His other hand came up, burying itself in her hair, tilting her head. The kiss deepened, and all the loneliness, all the fear, all the years of solitude and abuse, melted away in that one shared breath. He pulled back, just enough to look at her, his eyes dark, his breathing ragged. "Are you sure?" he rasped. "Clara, She stopped him, not with words, but by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "I am not afraid," she whispered. "Not of you." That was all he needed. That was the absolution he had been waiting for. He lifted her then, as easily as he had lifted her from the river, and carried her the few feet to the cot. He laid her down, and for a second, he just looked at her, his gaze so intense it was a physical touch. This was nothing like her marriage. Cyrus had taken her in the dark, a fumbling, angry, silent act of duty that she had endured. This was a slow, deliberate unwrapping. Luke's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon of her apron. His fingers were clumsy on the small buttons of her dress, and she had to help him. He was a man accustomed to rifles and axes, not to the delicate fabric of a woman's clothes. This trembling, this lack of expertise, was more intimate than any practiced move could have been. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his eyes never leaving hers. He kissed the places he uncovered. Her throat, where her pulse beat like a trapped bird. Her shoulder, where the wool had chafed her skin. He did not rush. He was worshipping. When she lay bare in the firelight, she did not cover herself. He looked at her, at the pale skin, the faint lines of hardship, and his expression was one of awe. Then it was her turn. She sat up and reached for the buttons of his shirt. Her own hands shook. She pulled the rough wool apart, baring his chest. It was hard, muscled, and covered in dark hair. And it was scarred. A long, puckered white line ran across his ribs, and a small, Round indentation was high on his shoulder. She touched them. She traced the long scar with her fingertip. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and his eyes closed. No one had touched those scars with tenderness. He shed the rest of his clothes, and then he was beside her on the narrow cot, his weight, his heat, surrounding her. He did not take her immediately. He held her. He kissed her face, her hair, her hands. He learned the shape of her with his mouth. It was a healing. Every touch from him seemed to erase a memory of a harsh hand, a cruel word. His caresses were questioning, not demanding. His hands, when they finally moved over her body, were not taking, they were asking, and she, who had never known she had anything to give, gave. She arched against him, her own hands no longer timid, but searching. She explored the hard planes of his back, the muscles in his arms. She kissed him with a fierceness that matched his, a wild, rising need that came not just from her body, but from her soul. When he finally moved over her, he paused, his body trembling with the effort of holding back. He looked down at her, his face taut with a mixture of desire and a pain so deep it nearly broke her heart. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered, his voice thick. "You won't," she breathed, and she pulled him down. It was a joining. It was a collision. It was breathless and silent and desperate. It was two broken, lonely people clinging to each other in the dark, forging a new, whole thing from their shattered pieces. It was not a taking, but a refuge. It was a long, slow, shuddering release that left them tangled and slick with sweat, their breathing the only sound in the small, warm cabin. They lay for a long time, her head on his chest, his arm holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. But she did not care. She listened to the heavy, slowing beat of his heart under her ear. The storm outside was nothing. The men on the ridge were nothing. There was only this. He was the first to speak. His voice was a low rumble against her hair. "I didn't tell you the whole truth," he said. She lifted her head, propping herself on an elbow to look at him. His eyes were closed, his face etched with a pain that had not been eased by their joining. "About why I left," he clarified. "About the cavalry." She waited, her hand resting on the center of his chest. "It wasn't just the slaughter. That was the beginning, the thing that broke the lock. But the reason I ran, the reason I'm a deserter." He opened his eyes, and they were bleak. It was 3 months later. We were at a fort near the Gila. The captain, he was a man like your Silas, hard, cruel. He thought the world was his to take. He swallowed, his gaze distant. Seeing a room 10 years in the past, he had a girl, a native girl, not Apache. She was from a small tribe the army didn't even have a name for. She worked in the laundry. She couldn't have been more than 15. His hand, the one not holding Clara, clenched into a fist on the blanket. "I was on guard duty. I heard a sound. From his quarters. A slap. A cry. I wasn't supposed to leave my post. I went anyway." He looked at Clara, and she saw the moment replay in his eyes. He had her, on the floor. He had torn her dress. He was hurting her. She was fighting, but she was small. His voice dropped to a dead, cold monotone. "He looked up when I came in. He was drunk. He laughed. He told me to get out, or I could have what was left." Clara's hand tightened on his chest, her nails digging in, but he didn't seem to notice. "I didn't think," Luke said. I saw her eyes, and I saw the men we had slaughtered in the canyon. I saw all of it. I pulled my sidearm. He was my superior officer. I shot him, twice." He took a ragged breath. "I killed him. He fell. The girl, she just looked at me. She didn't make a sound. She just ran. I helped her. I gave her my horse and pointed her toward the mountains. I never saw her again." He fell silent. Clara's heart was breaking. "I knew what would happen," he said, his voice hollow. "They wouldn't care what he was doing. I had killed a captain. I was a deserter, a murderer. They would have hung me before sundown. So I walked out of the fort. I took a canteen and my rifle, and I walked into the desert. I've been hiding ever and He finally looked at her, his face stripped bare, expecting to see horror, disgust. I ran. Clara stared at him, her vision blurring with tears. She saw the years of guilt he had carried, the crushing weight of this one righteous act. She lowered her head and kissed the small, round scar on his shoulder. "You didn't run, Luke," she whispered, her voice fierce. "You survived." She kissed the long, white scar on his ribs. "You did what was right. You saved her, and you survived." She raised her head and looked him in the eye, her own gaze clear and strong. She placed her hand flat over his heart. "I see you, Luke Remy." He stared at her, and his hard, stoic mask finally broke. A single hot tear escaped the corner of his eye and tracked down into his temple. He didn't wipe it away. He just pulled her down to him, burying his face in her hair, and held on as if she were the last solid thing on earth. The next morning, Clara woke first. She was wrapped in Luke's arms, her back to his chest, the blankets tangled around them. The cabin was cold. The fire had died to embers. For a moment, she lay in a state of pure, unprecedented peace. She was safe. She was warm. She was seen. She slipped from his grasp, her movement quiet. He murmured in his sleep but didn't wake. She padded, naked, across the cold floor to the stove, her body aching in a new and wonderful way. She added kindling and logs, blowing on the embers until they caught. As the cabin began to warm, Luke stirred. He woke as he did everything, quickly, and all at once. His eyes snapped open, and he saw her, standing by the fire, her silhouette dark against the growing flames. He said nothing, just watched her, a small, quiet smile touching his lips. The peace lasted for an hour. Luke got dressed and, as was his soldier's habit, went outside to check the perimeter. He was gone for a long time. Clara, dressing herself, began to feel the old, familiar knot of anxiety. The door opened. He stood there, not looking at her. His face was the hard mask from the day before. The tenderness of the night, the peace of the morning, was gone. "Luke?" He held up his gloved hand. He uncurled his fingers, and a small clump of gray, disturbed snow fell to the floor, melting instantly. "They're closer," he said, his voice dead. "Just beyond the lean-to. 3 of them." He stepped inside and barred the door. He walked to the wall and picked up his rifle. "They were there this morning, watching the cabin, waiting." Clara's blood ran cold, but the terror that would have once paralyzed her was replaced by a cold, hard anger. They had come to steal this one, small, new thing. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. "You," he said, checking the rifle's action. "We'll hide. There's a space under the cot. When they come, you get in it, and you don't make a sound. No matter what you hear." "No," Clara said. He stopped, looking at her as if she hadn't understood. "Clara, this is not a request. These are not men you can talk to. This is Silas. I know who it is." She walked to the table and picked up the skinning knife he had left there. She tested the edge with her thumb. It was sharp. "And I am not hiding. I am not a child, and I am not property." "You'll get yourself killed," he snarled, his fear for her making him angry. "You'll get yourself killed," she shot back, her voice shaking but firm. "You against 3. I won't hide in a hole and listen to them kill the only man who has ever seen me. I will not." She held his gaze, the knife steady in her hand. "Don't fight them alone. Luke, please, I'm begging you, don't leave me." He stared at her, at the small, fierce woman holding a knife, and the last of his resistance broke. She was not the woman he had found in the snow. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had made her strong, and now she was trying to save him. He gave a short, grim nod. "All right, but you do exactly what I say. When I say move, you move." He took a deep breath. "They'll come for the door first." They did not have to wait long. The silence of the hollow, which had been a comfort, was now a taut drumhead, waiting for the first strike. Luke stood by the window, a ghost in the gray light, his rifle now resting in the crook of his arm. Clara was by the stove, the skinning knife in her hand. Her knuckles were white, but her hand was steady. A voice, sharp and thin, cut through the cold air. "I know you're in there, Remy, and I know you've got her." Clara's heart stopped. "Silas!" The voice was unmistakable, laced with a whining arrogance and a cold fury. Luke's face did not change. He set his rifle carefully against the wall, in the shadows by the door. "He wants to talk," he said, his voice low. "Let him—" "Luke, no," she whispered, her fear a sudden, cold spike. "It's a trap." "Everything is a trap," he said. "This one, we spring." He unbarred the door, his movements calm, deliberate. He took his knife from his belt and tucked it into the back of his waistband. Hidden by his shirt, he looked at Clara, his gray eyes hard but holding a deep, wild warmth that was just for her. "Stay out of sight, but stay ready." He opened the door and stepped out onto the small, snow-covered patch of ground in front of the cabin. He kept his hands open, his coat pushed back, showing he was unarmed. Clara moved into the shadows by the door, her heart hammering so hard she was afraid they would hear it. She could see them. 3 men. They stood 20 yards away, near the edge of the trees, dark figures against the blinding white. One was Silas, his face pinched and red with cold, his eyes darting. Feral. He was holding a piece of paper in his gloved hand. The other 2 were hired men, hard cases, their faces blank and mean. One was a broad, heavy man with a shotgun. The other was thin, a weasel of a man, his hands in his pockets, a bulge suggesting a pistol. "That's far enough. Trespassers!" Luke's voice boomed, sharp and clear in the still air. It was the voice of a soldier, a voice used to giving commands and being obeyed. Silas took a step forward, the paper held out like a ward. "My name is Silas Wynn. I'm here on the law's business. That woman in your cabin is my property. She's my dead brother's widow, and by the law of this territory, her contract and his debts fall to me. She's a free woman," Luke said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She's under my protection." "Protection?" Silas laughed, a high, ugly sound. "Is that what you call it? She's a runaway, a thief, and a lunatic. I'm taking her back. This paper gives me the right—" "That paper's worthless out here." Luke said, "And so are you. This is my land. Turn around and ride out." The big man, Hutch, shifted the shotgun. "He's not asking, friend. He's telling, you send the woman out, and we'll leave you be." "And if I don't?" Luke asked. The weasel-like man, Greeley, pulled a bottle from his pocket. Kerosene. He uncorked it and smiled, showing brown, broken teeth. "Then we burn you out. A log cabin like this. It'll go up like a torch. We'll see how you like protection then." He took a step forward, splashing the dark liquid onto the snow near the woodpile. Clara's blood turned to ice. They would do it. They would burn them alive. Last chance. "Remy!" Silas spat. "Send her out." Before Luke could answer, Clara moved. She stepped out of the doorway, the knife still in her hand, and stood beside him. She was trembling from head to foot, but she held her head high, her eyes black with fury, locked on Silas. "I am not property," she said, her voice clear and carrying, a bell of pure, cold rage. "Not anymore." Silas's face contorted, seeing her, alive and defiant, standing next to this large, dangerous man, broke his thin veneer of control. "You whore!" he shrieked. "You'll come back with me if I have to drag your corpse!" He lunged. "Get her!" It was the spark. All 3 men moved at once. Silas, his eyes mad, ran for Clara. Hutch, the big man, raised his shotgun. Greeley, the weasel, pulled his pistol. Luke had been waiting for this. He did not move toward Silas. He moved toward the shotgun, the immediate, lethal threat. He covered the ground in 2 long strides, his body low. Hutch, surprised by the speed, tried to level the gun. He was too slow. Luke's hand shot out, grabbing the barrels, and he slammed them upward, toward the sky. The gun went off with a deafening, echoing boom that shook the hollow, the buckshot tearing through the high branches. At the same time, Luke drove his shoulder into the big man's stomach, lifting him off his feet. He pulled the knife from his back and, in one short, brutal, soldier's motion, drove it up under the man's ribs, deep into his heart. Hutch's eyes went wide with a terrible surprise. A soft, wet sigh escaped his lips. He was dead before he hit the snow. It had taken 2 seconds. As Luke was driving the knife home, Greeley, the weasel, fired his pistol. The shot went wild, but he was already moving, pulling a long knife of his own. He was fast. He saw Luke pulling his blade free from Hutch, his back exposed for a fraction of a second. Greeley lunged, stabbing Luke in the side. A deep, vicious cut. Luke roared, a sound of pure animal pain, and spun, his elbow catching Greeley in the face, breaking his nose. At the same instant, Silas reached Clara. He grabbed her hair, yanking her forward. "I'll kill you!" he screamed, his fingers clawing for the knife in her hand. Clara fought. She was not the woman who had fled the ranch. She drove her knee into his groin. Silas grunted, his grip loosening, and she twisted, slashing with the knife. She was not a fighter. She was clumsy. The blade caught his coat. Slicing the heavy wool, he slapped her, a hard, open-handed blow that sent her staggering back against the cabin wall. He raised his hand to hit her again. He never got the chance. Luke, bleeding heavily from his side, had turned from Hutch's body. He saw Greeley, stunned and bleeding from the face, and he saw Silas about to strike Clara. He made his choice. He ignored Greeley. He launched himself at Silas, his momentum carrying them both to the ground, away from Clara. Silas shrieked as they fell, but Luke was silent. He landed on top, his hand gripping Silas's throat. Greeley, his nose a bloody pulp, his eyes wide with terror, looked at the dead man on the snow. He looked at Luke, a bleeding, silent demon, choking the life out of Silas. He looked at Clara, who had pushed herself up and was raising her knife again. It was too much. This was not what he was paid for. He turned and ran. He scrambled up the bank, falling and pushing himself up, and disappeared into the trees, a trail of blood from his broken nose staining the snow. One dead, one fled. Luke's hand was still on Silas's throat. Silas was bucking, his face turning a deep, mottled purple, his legs kicking. "Luke!" Clara screamed. "Luke, don't! Stop!" Luke's head snapped up. He looked at her, his eyes wild, unfocused. He was back in the war, back in the fort, his hand on the captain's throat. "Luke!" she cried again, her voice cutting through his haze. "It's me. It's Clara. Let him go. He's beaten." The madness in his eyes receded. He looked down at the gasping, terrified man beneath him. He was pathetic, weak. He was not a threat. He was just a coward. Luke took his hand from his throat. He did not get up. He just sat there, breathing hard. Then, with a grunt of pain, he drove his fist into Silas's jaw. The sound was a dull, heavy crack. Silas went limp, unconscious. Luke stared at the man. "He'll freeze," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "Let him," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Luke shook his head. He looked at the dead man. Hutch. He looked at the blood spreading from his own side, a dark, crimson stain on his shirt, dripping onto the white snow. He looked at Clara. He got to his feet, swaying. He grabbed Silas by the collar and, in a single, agonizing movement, dragged him 20 feet and dumped him at the base of a pine tree. "If he wakes up," Luke said, his voice slurring, "he can follow his friend's tracks, or he can die. It's his choice." He turned and staggered back toward Clara. He made it 3 steps before his legs buckled. The world went gray at the edges. The loss of blood, the adrenaline, the fight. It was all too much. "Luke!" Clara caught him. She was small, but she was strong. She got her shoulder under his arm. taking his weight, and half dragged, half carried him back into the cabin. He collapsed onto the cot, his face a waxy pale gray, his breathing shallow. Clara slammed the door and dropped the bar. She turned, her back to the wood, and looked at him. He was lying in a spreading pool of his own blood. The trembling started. It was so violent she could barely stand. Her knees gave out, and she slid to the floor, the knife clattering from her numb fingers. She was safe. He was alive. They were safe. She covered her mouth, a dry, hysterical sob catching in her throat. No, not yet. He was hurt. He was bleeding. She had to stop it. She got to her feet, her movements jerky. She went to him. "Luke, Luke, stay with me. You have to stay with me." His eyes flickered open. They were cloudy with pain. "Greeley," he rasped. "The weasel. He got me." "He's gone," she said, her voice shaking. She grabbed his shirt and ripped it open. The wound was in his side, on his left, just above his hip. It was a deep, clean cut, 4 inches long, and it was bleeding. A steady, dark flow. It wasn't the spray of an artery, but it was deep. Too deep. "You have to stitch it," he whispered. "The kit, on the shelf." Clara flew to the shelf. She found the small, tin box. Inside was a spool of black thread, a curved needle, a bottle of whiskey, and some clean rags. A soldier's kit. She brought it back, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the bottle. "I can't," she whispered, looking at the raw, gaping wound. "Luke, I can't. My hands." He reached up, his own hand covered in his blood, and grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "You can," he said, his voice a low, hard command. "You're the woman who faced Silas. You're the woman who survived Cyrus. You can do this." He let go. She looked at his face, at the absolute, desperate trust in his eyes. He was right. She took a deep breath, and her hands grew steady. She poured the whiskey, first on the needle, then on the rag. "This will hurt," she said, her voice a whisper. "I've had worse," he grunted. She pressed the whiskey-soaked rag to the wound. Luke hissed, his entire body going rigid, his back arching off the cot. A low groan was torn from his throat, but he did not cry out. She cleaned it, her movements quick and efficient, her mind detached. She was mending a coat. She was stitching a feed sack. She threaded the needle, her fingers surprisingly nimble. "Hold still," she said. She pushed the needle through his skin. He grunted, his eyes squeezed shut, sweat beading on his forehead. She worked, pulling the thread tight, her stitches small and neat. She was trembling again, but her hands did not falter. She was binding him to her, binding him to this life, with thread and her own will. "You saved me," she whispered, her tears falling hot onto his cold skin. She didn't stop working. "You found me in the snow. You pulled me from the river." She pulled another stitch tight. "You saved me from Silas." I, he gasped, as the needle went through again. "Shh," she said. "Let me save you. Please, Luke. Let me save you too." She finished the last stitch and tied it off, her hands slick with his blood and her own tears. She cut the thread with a skinning knife. It was done. It was a raw, ugly, black seam. But the bleeding had stopped. She cleaned the skin around it, her touch gentle now, and then packed it with the last clean rag. He lay back, his breathing ragged, his face pale, but his eyes were clear. He was watching her. He had saved her. She had saved him. They were one. Clara stood, her whole body aching. She was covered in his blood. She looked at her hands, then at him. He was alive. He would sleep. She went to the small chest where she had put her few things. At the bottom was a small, folded paper. Her marriage certificate. The paper Silas had valued more than her life. The chain that had bound her to Cyrus. And then to him. She walked to the stove and opened the grate. The fire was burning hot. Luke watched her, his eyes heavy, but he knew what she was doing. She unfolded the paper. She read the names, Cyrus Wynne, Clara Blevins, her old name, her slave name. She held it to the fire. The corner blackened, curled, and caught. The names flared, turning to bright orange, then to black, floating ash, the ink that had defined her, that had declared her as property, dissolved into nothing. She let the last burning corner fall into the flames. She closed the grate, the sound a dull, final thud. She turned back to Luke. He was holding his hand out to her. She went to the cot and sat on the floor beside him, her body too exhausted to stand. She laid her head on the edge of the cot, next to his chest. He moved his arm, with agonizing slowness, and put his hand on her hair. She began to cry, not the hysterical sobs of her breakdown, not the quiet tears of her confession. This was a deep, cleansing flood. It was the tears for her lost child. It was the tears for the years of her lost life. It was the tears of a fear so profound she had not known it was there until it was gone. He just held her, his fingers stroking her hair, his own face tight with pain, and with something else, a deep, profound peace. She cried onto his chest, her tears washing away the blood. Later, as darkness fell, the storm returned. The wind, which had been still for the fight, rose again, howling around the corners of the cabin, rattling the door in its frame. It was a wild, furious sound, the sound of a world trying to tear itself apart, but inside, there was peace. Luke woke. The pain in his side was a hot, dull fire, but his mind was clear. Clara was asleep, her head on a pillow next to his cot, her hand resting on his arm, as if to make sure he was still there. He looked at her, at the dried tear tracks on her face, at the soot still smudged on her cheek. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb brushing her skin. Her eyes opened, and she was instantly awake. "Luke, I'm here," he rasped. "You're here." She looked at the door, where the wind was slamming against the bar. "The storm," she whispered. "It's just wind," he said. He looked at her. "The real storm is over." She stood, and her body ached. She looked at him, at the stitches, at the paleness of his face. She went to the stove and added logs, then came back. She did not get back on the floor. She gently, carefully, eased onto the cot, lying on her good side, facing him. The cot was narrow, and she was pressed against him. He turned his head on the pillow. He looked at her, and his eyes were full of a light that had not been there before. The hunger was gone. The loneliness was gone. He leaned his head forward, and she met him. Their kiss was not the desperate, healing fire of the night before. It was slow. It was deep. It was the kiss of two people who had nothing left to prove, and nothing left to hide. It was a promise. He made love to her, slowly, carefully, mindful of his wound. It was not a taking, and it was not a healing. It was a devotion. It was the quiet, profound, unspoken language of two souls who had fought a war together and won. It was a confirmation of life, a defiant act against the dead man in the snow and the howling wind outside. It was peace. Afterward, they lay tangled, the cabin warm and still, the only sound the roar of the wind, which now seemed like a distant, unimportant thing. "In the spring," Luke whispered, his voice rough, his lips against her hair. "When the past clears." She was quiet, her hand on his heart. "We could," he started, his voice thick. "We could go, California, Oregon, somewhere new, somewhere they've never heard of Silas Wynne, or Captain." Clara was quiet for a long time. She thought of the cabin, this small, log fortress that had been her prison, her shelter, and her sanctuary. She thought of the man lying dead in the snow. "Or," she said, her voice soft but strong, "we could stay." He lifted his head, surprised. "Stay? Here? After this?" "We could rebuild," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We'll have to tell the law. About the body, about your captain. We'll have to face it. But we'll do it together." She looked up at him. "This is your home. Luke, you built it, and I think it's mine, too." He looked at her, at the strength he had not known she possessed, the strength he had given her. Starting again, rebuilding, not running. He pulled her closer, his good arm holding her tight. Spring, he said, the word a promise. We'll see, in the spring. He kissed her forehead, and they fell asleep, wrapped in a single blanket. The storm now just whined in the trees, and a deep, quiet warmth blooming inside them. The thaw came not as a gentle melt, but as a great, cracking sigh. The world, locked for months under a roof of ice and snow, began to move. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, a steady, rhythmic sound that replaced the howl of the wind. The creek, which had been a frozen, black scar, began to roar, its voice angry and full. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes, revealing the pale, flattened brown grass of the year before. Luke's wound healed. Clara, who had never known she possessed such a steady hand, tended to it with a fierce, quiet devotion. She cleaned it, she changed the rags, and she watched, with a breath she felt she had held for days, as the raw, red edges knit themselves together, the black thread she had sewn becoming a part of him. He was scarred again, another mark of a life of survival. But this scar, she felt, was hers. As he regained his strength, the dynamic of the cabin shifted. The fear was gone. The desperation was gone. The air, once thick with tension and unspoken needs, was now light. It was filled with the sounds of ordinary life. Sounds that were, for both of them, extraordinary. "You need to learn," he said one afternoon, the air warm enough that they could stand outside the cabin door without a coat. His voice was firm. He was holding his rifle, not the heavy one he kept for long range, but a smaller Winchester, light and well-oiled. Clara looked at it, her fear of the weapon a cold knot in her stomach. I've never held one. Cyrus didn't allow it." "Cyrus is gone," Luke said, his voice flat but not unkind. He held it out to her. "Stock first. The world is full of men like Silas, and I won't always be there to drag them off you." She took it. The weight surprised her. The cold, smooth wood and the heavy steel. It felt solid. It felt like power. He taught her. He was a patient, methodical teacher, the soldier in him precise and clear. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder to avoid the kick. "Let it become part of you," he said, his hands on her arms, shifting her stance. His touch was practical, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her. He showed her how to load, the click-click of the cartridge sliding into the chamber. He showed her how to sight, how to line up the notch with the bead, how to breathe. "Let half your breath out," he instructed, his voice low by her ear. "And squeeze. Don't ever pull. Squeeze." He set up a tin can on a log 50 yards away. Her first shot was a deafening blast that made her flinch, and the bullet kicked up snow 10 feet to the left. "You pulled," he said, not unkindly. "You're afraid of the sound. It's loud. It's supposed to be." He stood back. Again. She shot again, and again. She spent the morning firing at the can, her shoulder beginning to ache, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nose. She missed. She hit the log. "I can't," she said, frustrated, lowering the rifle. "You can." He stepped up behind her, his body pressing against her back, his arms coming around hers. He put his hands over hers, on the stock and the trigger. "Feel it," he whispered. "Your body, the rifle, the target, all one line." She could feel his chest against her shoulder blades, his solid, steady warmth. She could feel his breath on her cheek. "Breathe," he said. She did. "Half out." She let it out. "Now." His finger squeezed hers. The rifle fired, a jolt that she felt through both their bodies. The tin can pinged and flew off the log, spinning into the snow. Clara gasped. She had done it. She turned in his arms, her face, bright with a sudden, fierce pride, turned up to his. "I did it." "I know," he said, his voice rough. He was looking at her mouth, not the can. The lesson ended there. He taught her to ride, bolder. The gray gelding was his only horse, and he was protective of him. But he saw the way she had with the animal, her voice soft, her hands gentle. He lifted her onto the saddle, his hands spanning her waist. "He's tall," she said, her voice small, her legs dangling. She had not been on a horse in years. "He'll keep you safe," Luke said. He took the bridle. "I'll lead you." He led her around the small clearing, the snow sucking at his boots. She felt the power of the animal beneath her, the smooth, rolling gait. It was a feeling of freedom, of height, of possibility. Within an hour, she was holding the reins herself. Within a day, she was trotting him in a circle. Her laughter, a sound she had almost forgotten, ringing clear in the mountain air. She grew stronger. The weeks of meager rations and terror had left her thin and pale. But now, with regular food, the rabbits and deer Luke began to bring in, and the hard, physical work, she changed. Color came back to her cheeks. Muscle defined her arms. The hollows in her throat filled out. She moved with a new purpose, her back straight, her head high. She was no longer a shadow. She was a woman. The world was changing. The snow was almost gone from the hollow, lingering only in the deep, northern shadows. The ground was a riot of mud and new, green shoots. One morning, Luke stood by the window, his face grim. "It's time," he said. Clara knew what he meant. The ground was soft enough. They took the shovel. The body of Hutch, the big man, lay where it had fallen, preserved by the cold. A dark, still shape against the mud. They had not touched it. Silas, they knew, was gone. The tracks leading away from the hollow, the tracks of the weasel, Greeley, had been joined by a second, staggering set. Silas had woken. He had run. Luke dug the grave. He chose a spot on the hillside, under a stand of aspen, where the morning sun would hit. He dug for 2 hours, his stitches pulling, his face set. Clara sat and watched, the rifle resting across her lap. When he was done, he stood, wiping the sweat from his face. "Get his things," he said. Clara went through the man's pockets. Her hand shook, but she did it. A half-empty packet of tobacco, a worn silver dollar, a small tin picture of a woman she did not know, holding a baby. Clara's heart ached. This man, this murderer, had been a person. He had a family. He had died for Silas Wynn's greed. They rolled his body into the shallow grave. They stood over it, 2 dark figures against the bright spring sky. "He shouldn't have come here," Luke said. It was all the eulogy he had. "Do you think—" "Does he have a name?" Clara asked, clutching the small, tin picture. "Hutch. I heard Silas call him Hutch." Clara placed the tin picture on his chest. "May God have mercy on your soul, Hutch," she whispered. Luke shoveled the dirt. The sound was a dull, final thudding. When it was done, they rolled a large stone to the head of the grave. Luke, with his knife, carved one word into a piece of scrap wood and jammed it into the earth. Hutch. They stood there for a long time. The air was clean, the scent of pine and damp earth. "The law," Luke said, his voice low. "When they find Greeley, or when Silas talks, they'll come. They'll find the grave." Clara looked at the fresh mound of earth. She looked at Luke, at the man who had killed to protect her, the man who was a wanted deserter. She felt a surge of strength, as pure and cold as the river. "Then they will come," she said. She reached out and took his hand, her small, strong fingers lacing with his. "And we will tell them the truth. We will face it together." He looked at their joined hands. He had been alone for 10 years. He had run and hidden and braced himself for the end. He had never, not once, imagined someone standing beside him. He squeezed her hand, a single, hard pressure. Together. A week later, Clara sat at the small table, a piece of foolscap paper in front of her. Luke had found it in his sparse supplies, along with a small bottle of ink and a nib pen. She was writing a letter. Her hand, now steady, moved across the page. "My dearest Mary," she wrote to a woman she had known in the town near Cyrus's ranch, another widow, a woman who had shown her a small, secret kindness once, slipping her a jar of preserves after Cyrus had forbidden her to speak to anyone. You must have thought me dead. In some ways, I was... She did not tell her everything. She did not speak of Silas's attack, or the fight, or the dead man on the hill. She wrote of the storm. She wrote of being found. She wrote of a good, quiet man who had given her shelter, who had saved her life. I am alive. I am free. And for the first time in as long as I can remember, I am safe. She signed her name. Clara, not Clara Wynne. Just Clara. We need to go to town, she said to Luke, folding the letter. I need to post this. The nearest town was 30 miles, a full day's ride. It was called Mineral Creek, a small, rough settlement that served the trappers and the few, desperate miners in the range. Luke had avoided it. Going there meant supplies, but it also meant eyes. It meant people. He looked at the letter. He looked at her face, at the resolve in her eyes. This was not a request. It was the next step. All right, he said. Tomorrow. They rode Boulder, Luke in the saddle and Clara riding behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her cheek resting against his back. The world was a dizzying, vibrant green. The snow was gone, and the mountains had exploded with life. Wildflowers, purple, yellow, and white, poked through the mud. The air was warm. It was the most beautiful ride of her life. She felt the solid, warm presence of Luke in front of her, the power of the horse beneath them. She was not fleeing. She was not being taken. She was going. Mineral Creek was a single, muddy street lined with a dozen false front buildings, a saloon, a general store, a land office, and, at the far end, a small, clapboard building with a sign that read, Post. As they rode down the street, everything stopped. Men, who had been loafing on the boardwalk, stood up. Faces appeared in the windows. They stared. They stared at Luke, the big, bearded mountain man, a recluse known only by rumor, and they stared at the woman he had with him, a woman with dark hair and a pale, serious face. Her arms wrapped around him as if she belonged there. Clara felt the heat of their eyes, the weight of their whispers. She had spent her life shrinking from such notice. She had been taught that to be seen was to be judged, to be in danger. She felt Luke tense beneath her, his body becoming a shield. He hated this. He hated their prying, judging eyes. Clara loosened her grip on his waist. She sat up straighter, and as Luke reined Boulder in front of the post office, she reached down and took his hand, the one that rested on the saddle horn. She laced her fingers with his, in plain view, for the whole, whispering town to see. It was a small gesture. It was a declaration of war. It was her claiming him. Luke looked down at her hand on his. He looked at the staring faces, and, for the first time, he did not feel the urge to run. He gave her hand a squeeze and dismounted, then reached up and lifted her down, his hands at her waist, setting her on the boardwalk as if she were made of glass. The post office was a small, hot room that smelled of ink and dust. The postmaster, a thin man with a green eye shade, peered at them over his spectacles. "Help you?" he asked, his eyes darting from Luke to Clara. "A letter," Clara said, her voice steady. She slid the letter and a coin onto the counter. The postmaster looked at the name. "Mary Abernathy, down near the Wynne Ranch, ain't it? Bad business, that." Luke went still. "What business?" "Oh," the postmaster said. "Glad for a bit of gossip. Heard it on the wire last week. Silas Wynne, the brother, found him half frozen on the prairie, rambling like a lunatic. Claimed he'd been set upon by bandits. Then, when the marshal pressed him, his story changed. Started accusing a runaway, a woman, his sister-in-law." Clara's blood ran cold. "But here's the thing," the postmaster said, leaning in. "Marshal didn't buy it. Sent a wire to Kansas, checking on a few things. And it seems that wasn't the first time Mr. Silas Wynne had trouble with a woman. Seems he was run out of 2 counties for assault. His whole story fell apart." Clara stared at him, her mouth dry. They didn't believe him?" "Not a word. They're holding him." "Fraud. I think trying to lay claim to a property that wasn't his. The postmaster shrugged. Then his eyes drifted to a stack of old notices tacked to the wall. He squinted at Luke. "You," he said. "You look familiar." Luke's hand, resting on the counter, clenched into a fist. This was it. The postmaster walked to the wall and pulled down a faded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a 10-year-old wanted poster. The drawing was rough, but it was him. Luke Remy. Deserter. Murder. "This," the postmaster began. "Luke," Clara whispered, grabbing his arm. "Hold on, ma'am," the postmaster said, not unkindly. He was scanning a newer-looking telegraph message tacked just below the poster. "I knew I'd seen that name." He looked at Luke, his expression one of confusion, and then awe. "It says here, Remy," he read, squinting at the telegraph. "Name cleared. Came down the wire. Oh, must be 2 months ago. From Arizona territory. New testimony. Seems that captain you were accused of killing was a right monster. A native girl, the one they said you abducted. She came forward, told the whole story. How he, well, you know, and how you saved her. You ain't a deserter. Mister, seems you're a hero." Luke stared at the man. He did not, could not, move. The words were simple, but they did not make sense. Cleared. Hero. The girl. She had survived. She had told the truth. The weight of 10 years, the weight of the running, of the guilt, of the hiding. It all crashed down on him. He felt his knees go weak. He put a hand on the counter to steady himself. Clara was holding his other arm, her grip iron. She was crying, silent tears of joy streaming down her face. He was not a murderer. He was not a deserter. He was free. He looked at Clara, at her beautiful, tear-streaked face. He looked at the postmaster, who was staring at him as if he had just seen a ghost. Luke grabbed Clara's hand, threw a coin on the counter for the letter, and, without a word, pulled her out of the post office. Into the bright, clear sunshine. They rode home in silence. Her arms once again wrapped around him, but this time, she was not holding him for protection. She was just holding him. Weeks passed. The mountain spring turned into early summer. The hollow was a paradise of green, the air sweet with pine and wild roses. The grave on the hill was covered in new grass. Luke was a different man. The hardness in his eyes had softened. The lines of tension around his mouth were gone. He still did not speak much, but his silences were peaceful. He laughed more, the rusty sound becoming common, clear. He had told the marshal. He had ridden down, alone this time, and told him everything. About Hutch, about Silas, about Clara. The marshal had listened, had looked at the grave, and had clapped Luke on the shoulder. The man Silas had hired, Greeley, had been caught, and had told the whole true story in exchange for a lighter sentence. The case, the marshal said, was closed. One evening, they sat on the small porch Luke had built, watching the sunset, the sky a blaze of orange and violet. The last high patches of snow on the peaks looked like pink cotton. Clara was mending one of his shirts, her head bent to the task. Luke was carving a piece of wood. He stopped. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the dark, soft waves of her hair. He looked at the home they had built, the home they had defended. He got up from his chair and knelt in front of her. Clara looked up, her needle pausing. "Luke, is your side hurting?" He said nothing. He reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a ring. He pulled out a small, simple loop made of 3 strands of leather, braided together with a soldier's tight precision. It was strong. It was simple. It was unbreakable. He took her hand, the one that had learned to shoot, to ride, to stitch his skin. He slipped the leather loop onto her 3rd finger. "I don't have much," he said, his voice thick, his gray eyes locked on hers. "This cabin, a horse, a rifle, and a life I didn't want until you were in it." He swallowed, his throat working. "I won't let the world take you from me again. Clara, I won't let anyone hurt you, ever." Clara's eyes filled with tears, blurring his strong, Dear face, I promise you, he finished, his voice a low, rough vow. I will not let you go. She stared at the braided leather on her hand. She thought of the gold band Cyrus had given her, a band of ownership, cold and heavy, this loop of leather. This was a promise, this was a bond. She put her mending aside and reached out, cupping his rough, bearded face in both her hands. She looked into his eyes, and he saw his whole, new world there. Then don't ever stop holding me, she whispered. He rose, pulling her to her feet, and kissed her, a long, deep kiss that tasted of summer and forever. The last snowfall of the season came a week later. It was not a blizzard, not a storm of malice. It was a gentle, quiet dusting of white, a last farewell to the winter that had nearly killed them, the winter that had brought them together. They stood on the porch, wrapped in a single, heavy blanket, his arms around her, her back pressed against his chest. They watched the big, soft flakes drift down, melting as they touched the green grass. The wind moved through the high pines, but it was not a scream. It was just wind in the trees, and inside the blanket, inside the small cabin, a deep, steady warmth was blooming. A warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope it brought a little warmth to your day. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share them in English in the comments below. Let me know where in the world you're listening from. And if you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories like this one.